Sanani, good evening, Dimalang, and welcome to the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Zama Khumalo. It's a Monday edition of the Private Property Podcast, and it's always a pleasure to have you join us on the Private Property Podcast. It is a Monday. We're kickstarting things and, of course, looking forward to an incredible week in property. And talking about an incredible week in property, some of what you can look forward to this week, of course, it is a Private Property Podcast daily on your screens at 7 p.m. And every Tuesdays and Thursdays, Umbali Noko brings you the Farming Podcast at 8 p.m. And on Wednesdays, SD Klassen brings you the First Time Home Buyers Show at 8 p.m. And over the weekend, Chad brings you the Home Shoppers Show, where you get to get a snapshot of some of the best estates that the country has on offer. So that's some of what you can look forward to right here on the Private Property social media platforms. We absolutely love hearing from you. So do show us some love down here below. Of course, let your friends and family know that you are watching the Private Property Podcast. And to kickstart, or even before we kickstart, this evening's conversation, which I'm very excited about because it's quite a hot topic, and I'm very keen to also hear some of your views at home about this one. Before we kickstart that, we are on week 3 of our Sherlock Holmes competition. So we've already had 2 winners who've walked away with that 5,000 Rand voucher, and we're still going to be at it for the next 10 weeks. And all you have to do to stand a chance of walking away with that 5,000 Rand voucher is to solve the riddle. And of course, you also stand a chance of winning that grand mystery prize. And this week's riddle, is, and I see it's also already on our screens, it is: where the dolphins play and Zimbabwe and Bali meet, lies an avenue of palms, 4 corners to rest your seat. So that's the riddle for the 3rd week of our Sherlock Holmes competition. So do make sure that you go to www.privateproperty.co.za. We want to see if you can crack the riddle and be one of our winners later on this week. While we are on social media, whether you're watching us on YouTube or on Facebook, you can also follow myself on @Zamadunga_K. And we're getting, this topic is one that I love. And we couldn't have gotten anybody else to talk about it than my guest. He needs no introduction. We've had him before on the show last year. He was one of our first guests. I mean, he was one of the 2 guests that we had on episode 1 last year. So, of course, we have to bring him back in. That is, of course, Zhakele Myeza, who is the founder of Bus Stop Properties. Zakhele, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Zama. How are you doing? Always nice to be here.
It's nearly 1 year to the day since we had you for the first time. I mean, we started, it was the 30th of March. We'll probably see if we can plan something around the anniversary and definitely rope you in. And this evening with Zach, we're going to be looking at hot tips on how to get the most out of your student accommodation investment. And one of the big things that I actually want Zach and I to even go through is, I'll say, the future of student accommodation as an investment vehicle. We know that historically, certainly in the last few years, you get very high yields. One of the things that happened with COVID is a lot of landlords were very hard hit, especially landlords who were servicing the student accommodation space. And with a lot of them now feeling a bit wary, wondering if universities are just going to almost go full on digital and there won't be a need for student accommodation. We know that the figures, we'll say pre-COVID figures, were that there was a shortage of beds, and quite a lot of them, and the institutions themselves did not have capacity to fill all those beds. And so it really was one of those lucrative markets that you could go into because it's just a shortage. And every single year, we see it all the time. Students find themselves stranded in different parts of the country because there wasn't enough space at rest. So now that we've seen almost a full academic calendar being conducted online with so many students working from home, it certainly does beg the question of where student accommodation as an investment vehicle is headed. And I want us to talk about that, Zach, before we even get to some of the tips of then how you go about maximizing, your investment. And maybe let's go into it, right, Zach, because I've had so many conversations with different landlords who do have student accommodation places and some of them were bleeding, right? And some of them were able to either still have their same tenants who said, look, home is actually not conducive for me to live there. So in as much as we're doing online school, I still actually need a place to stay. And others were, changed it from student accommodation, put in young professionals or a family. So they took a knock in terms of the amount of money they would typically collect when, obviously students stay there, but they were still able to collect rental. When you look at where we currently are with the shortage, but also the rise of online learning, where do you see the student accommodation segment as an investment vehicle headed?
So I'd say we're in very interesting times. The student accommodation has been around for a long time, and I still feel there is a need for student accommodation. Not all learning can happen online. So at this moment, we've got 1 or 2 years of uncertainty where we don't know what's going to happen, and having the right sort of strategy and the right sort of tips, some of these tips that I might give today will actually help your student accommodation live through these next 2 years, because we all uncertain at the moment. But I can definitely say that student accommodation as a vehicle and as an asset class is definitely one that's going to stay. It's taken a knock now, but it'll come back and it will stay. Mm-hmm. Even with the online learning, I feel the online learning it offers an opportunity to landlords. Because if I was a student and one of your biggest pluses was constant fast internet that I can online learn versus being at home where I might be distracted by family or even just myself wanting to go to the fridge too often, I'll go stay in rent.
Yeah. And I think, that's definitely one of the big things that a lot of landlords are going to have to, especially the smaller landlords as opposed to the big developers, because with the big developers, it's pretty much a given. So having fast internet in your student accommodation place now is a necessity and not a nice to have. I think there was a time when it used to be a nice to have and a lot of landlords didn't include it in their package. But now with so much learning essentially happening online, you absolutely cannot not have it, because part of why a student would opt to stay in your place is that they would, as you're saying, have all the resources that they need in order for them to continue learning. Then Zach, maybe let's get to the first tip that you shared with investors who are thinking about it, because as you're saying, one of the things that absolutely picked up is there are quite a lot of student accommodation properties that are on the market right now, and this is across the country. So if you almost look at all the areas that are around the universities, there's quite a lot of accommodation, on the market. And with some, it's because maybe the landlords were already slightly frustrated with dealing with students, and maybe was slightly on the fence, but with COVID and the effects of COVID, are probably like, let me just cut my losses. I don't really want to do student accommodation. So there definitely are a lot of buying opportunities. And so for viewers at home who are potentially looking at buying student accommodation places, what would that first tip be for them in terms of looking at student accommodation as an investment vehicle?
So one would have to look at it from their investment point in a holistic point of view. As you pointed out, I myself have been shopping around and seeing plenty of student accommodations that are coming up and on the market and not selling. And purely because the landlords or the previous owners had transformed this property from being a house into what ends up being a prison. It looks like a prison and they want the value for it. And because they were getting a return previously, it's now priced higher, but now they can't sell. So that already gives you the first big tip in terms of when you buy the property, you've got to plan ahead. You've got to plan for 10 years' time, and you've got to convert your property such that it can be sellable in a time like this. I think COVID has given us the best test to say, should something like this happen again in a couple of years' time or down the line, are you prepared? Before we weren't prepared, and now we've had a trial run. We've got to be prepared of how we're going to then take it after the investment and after COVID. So definitely we would have to, convert for future sales.
Zach, I'm actually so glad that this is the first tip, because one of the big things around it is also that some of the current owners of these student accommodation places also transformed their properties or renovated their properties without all the without notifying the municipality or the bank. So they actually cannot sell it. Never mind being overpriced. I think the overpricing, you can negotiate it down. But even if you were to negotiate it down by 30, 40%, a bank is just not touching that property, because when they look at the plans, when the moment they bring their evaluator and they see the structural changes that have been done, no financial institution was notified. Certainly the municipality wasn't notified. And so you're sitting with this house that in effect isn't compliant, and you're struggling to sell it. So I think it's also one of those things, as an owner, if you're currently an owner, that if you are going to find some of these gems, do plan ahead, as Zach is saying, and don't just plan ahead for, putting too much money into it, but also if you're going to want to sell it, you might sell it to somebody, for example, who wants to get it bonded, as opposed to a cash buy. I mean, a cash buyer wouldn't think twice about this. They'd buy it and kind of look at the long-term potential yield that they might get. But somebody who's going to be going to a financial institution for the financing, something like that is going to be important. And I think, Zach, oftentimes when you are when you've just bought your new property that you want to convert to student accommodation, you tend to not think about this. If anything, you see this 3-bed and you think, look, I can probably make this a 6-bed. This is how I can partition the rooms and whatnot, without thinking of all the relevant steps and checks that you need to do to make sure that your house is properly compliant, especially if you're going to sell it in the future.
And compliance is where a lot of people are actually losing the money, because people forget that the bank looks at a property and thinks about how much it's going to cost to put that property back into a residential, if it's in a residential area. And if you haven't factored that in, and you come to a time of crisis, you won't even be able to offload that asset fast enough. I've seen a lot of landlords who are trying to dispose of what was previously a cash flowing property, and they can't dispose of it fast enough, and they're finding themselves in great difficulty because of this very compliance issue that they've got.
I'm in conversation with Zhakele Myeza, who's the founder of Bus Stop Properties. We're talking about student accommodations, sharing tips on how you can get the most out of your student accommodation investment. If you're exploring going into student accommodation, this is certainly the episode for you. These are some of the things that you need to be watching out for before buying a student accommodation place, and also what you should be doing once you have it. And we're going to get to that because Zach, this is something that Zach has experience in. For our viewers at home, I certainly want to hear from the landlords. If you're currently in student accommodation, how was the 2020 period? I mean, we went into lockdown when the academic calendar had already started. Were you able to retain all your tenants throughout 2020, or did some of them decide, look, I actually am going to cancel my lease, going to move back home? And how were you able to essentially survive the rest of 2020 if you're in the student accommodation space? And to those of you who are considering going into it, what are some of your reasons? I mean, are you scared of the move to work online? Do you think we're not going to get tenants, or are you wary of student accommodation because you're going to have to deal with more than one tenant, and you're just thinking, look, this is more stress than it's worth? Do share your views down here below. I love hearing from you. We certainly want to hear some of your views when it comes to student accommodation. Now, Zach, then what would be the second tip that our viewers at home needs to be mindful of when it comes to their student accommodation investment?
So I'm going to just take it back a step. Where I wanted to start is because of where I sit now. I know a lot of doctors, lawyers, CEOs who stayed in student accommodations that now live in these big fancy houses. They buy student accommodation and they convert them into prisons. And when I say prisons, is what they just stack beds for maximum return. And that in itself becomes a lot of the problem, that they're not converting for the human beings that are going to live there, they're converting for return. So when I look at, what's my hot tip when I look at a student accommodation is, you've got to look at the student accommodation firstly as a business. And I look at it in 3 levels. You've got to look at it from the business level, an operational level, and then a systematic level. And I'll start from the first one, the business level. And that's where my return is made. So when I first go into my student accommodation, as we've already discussed, you make money when you buy. When you make money when you buy, you've got to take into account all of your expenses. And then you've got to maximize your return, but ethically. I know a lot of people who would buy a place, R1 million, and they can turn over 60, 70,000 Rand a month from that, but they've crammed students in. Now, come time of COVID, and I'm wanting to stay at res, but you're making me stay in a room with 4 people. I can't move. There's 4 other people in the next room. There's 4 other people in the lounge. It's not a conducive environment. So you've got to look at it from that business level as well to say, how do I maximize from a business perspective? And then one of the biggest issues when we're still talking about this business level is people don't design for their losses. And what I say when I say design for your losses, November, December, January time is the time the time where your income can be low. You hear a lot of people say, yes, we can let it out for vacation and holiday makers, but stay in a place that is so comparted and it doesn't have any recreational space. You don't feel like you're on holiday yourself. You say touring groups and churches, and no one really wants to stay in that accommodation. So if you design an accommodation and your student accommodation such that you can cater for more than just your students thereafter, and you can do it very simply, whereby you can convert the space by moving beds, having a storage area, obviously calculating your costs to ensure that you're not making a loss by putting your stuff in storage. But it's something that has to be looked at holistically. So the business level, when it comes to how do I invest, you have to look at it from the business level and break it down from the business level first. So
we are taking your questions and comments on student accommodation. We're looking at where student accommodation is, but more than anything, we're looking at tips for you to maximize your student accommodation investments. If you're considering going into student accommodation, these are some of the things that you want to be aware of and also plan for, because I think often a lot of people will talk about how with student accommodation, you're able to get double-digit yield and they'll tell you how much money that they're able to make, but you really want to get a very holistic picture of how student accommodation works and also how you can go about maximizing your returns in an ethical way. And I love that you bring that up, Zakhele, because oftentimes I've seen a lot of landlords and even students, they openly speak about this, how you go to a place, rent is X amount, and when you go in there, the room is so small, there aren't actually enough bathrooms for the number of people who are expected to stay there. So one tip that I'll definitely slide in there when it comes to, we'll say, the ethical way of making money is that even beyond the ethics, you need to look at what the minimum requirements essentially are for the student accommodation. I know that the Department of Higher Education actually has what the prescribed I'll say specs for student accommodation places typically are. And that should give you a very good guideline of what is expected. And if you're going to want to cut corners in terms of those guidelines, then you essentially, working on the unethical side where you want to squash 5 students, for example, into one big bedroom, whereas that isn't part of the prescribed rules. So I think definitely as somebody who wants to be a landlord, go to the department's website. They really do have it on there. And it gives you a really good outline of if X number of students are going to live in a place, these are how many bathrooms ought to be there, and those kinds of things. Because, for example, you can't have 15 students staying in a house and there's one bathroom. That simply isn't something that should fly. And so that's one of the things I think you need to be aware of, and not just think, I'm going to put in as many students. I know they're going to be desperate, and therefore their parents are going to pay that money. I think we need to definitely move beyond that kind of thinking. I see here we've got a comment from Usame Mahlatse on Facebook who said, I made sure when I renovate my house, it can also be turned into student and normal tenants, as I had to think about the future, which is so important. It's what Zach was saying, is that you also don't want to change the specs of the house so much that the only thing that's possible is for it to be essentially like a dorm. And let's say you've taken one fairly decent sized bedroom and you cut it in half, and not even with, you actually put bricks instead of, a nice partition wall. and you like go and build it up, it's going to make it difficult to try and change that into, you know, normal residential living, because no family wants to stay in those small res-like rooms, you know, because it really is just for students. It's a dormitory. So you really need to be aware of that. So Zach, then what's the next tip that we need to be able to be aware of if we want to maximize our student accommodation investment?
All right. So now when we're looking at these tips, we're looking at the operational level. Yes. Because this is where you make your money. It's where your money can be lost. And we touched on one of the topics already, was compliance. And compliance in terms of the rules, you touched on that there are national rules that are out there, but each and every university actually has a set of guidelines. If you've gone through the national rules and you've actually measured out the space that they say a student should live in, you'll realize that it actually is very, very tight. And that's why I go on the ethical side to say, look, I wouldn't live in 7 square meters. I'd want to make it slightly bigger. So on the operational level, compliance makes you money, because a compliant student accommodation, even the university could assist you in times when students are coming back and they need a place to stay. They would much rather refer to a compliant residence than one that is just a private residence that's trying to get maximum return. So compliance on the operational level. I'd also then say on a good tip is, don't be cheap in high usage areas. Now, and when I say don't be cheap in high usage areas, it goes down to the maintenance of the property. You're going to have students, they're up and down. It's not their property. So the way a person would handle the property is very, very different. So you don't want to be cheap on things that move, things that rotate, doors, hinges, all those sorts of appliances, because there'll be, if you're having appliances, there'll be lots of cooking in your geysers and how your installation is done, and also just segregating the place electrically so you can fault find. So those are the things that don't be cheap in high usage areas, because it ends up costing you a lot in the long run and in maintenance. It also then allows you, when you've done it properly, to segregate the area whereby maybe half your accommodation is being used. You can shut down the other half of your residence and save money. So those sort of tips one wants to look at. The other tip is stay on top of your maintenance. If you've ever gone through and shopped and been in a complex's value is given by how well maintained that complex is. Before you've even gone into the property, you see how well the gardens are kept. You see if there's a security guard, if there's a gate, if it's operational. And then only when you get in and you see how pretty the place is, would you be willing to pay more? So when I say stay on top of your maintenance, you keep your student accommodation in tip-top condition. You will have students consistently. You will also be able to demand a higher price. And your higher price is based on how well you're keeping your accommodation. Mm-hmm. So I think that'd be a very, very good one. And where to learn on how to keep your accommodation? Well, you've got options. One is outsource it, where you would pay someone who knows. Option two, I'm sure you've had on the Private Property podcast, Marissa Robas or people from the Property Academy, where they talk about maintenance. And they had a book, The Proud Homeowner. And I stand by that book because it taught me how to look at a property from a maintenance point of view. So you know exactly how to stay on top of your property and not to lose money through maintenance. Mm-hmm. And then the last one is make friends with builders. It'll save you a lot of money.
Like I'm catching myself. Like that's trust fire to me. I'm gonna catch myself.
Yeah, you've got to make friends with builders and yourself. Understand what goes into building. When you say make friends with builders, it doesn't mean be naive. You can meet very friendly builders who will still rip you off. So make friends so that you can get the right advice. Make friends such that you know that the relationship you're in is a long-term relationship. You're not looking for someone who's going to come into your property and do one sort of fix and leave, and you get someone different every time. Because if you get someone different every time, they'll always find something else that's wrong. So you make friends with your builders, a good maintenance person, and you stick by them, and you understand the maintenance that should be done, record your maintenance, and then analyze how much you're spending on your maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from an operational level, that's the tips that one would look at.
And you know, I think, Zakhele, that's probably one of the areas that we tend to underestimate quite a lot, because you don't know until you're in it just how much maintenance is going to be needed. And even when, for example, you know, you got the place, there wasn't much that you needed to change. Perhaps before you got your set of students, you're able to do those few renovations so that new students can go in. The moment they do, then you realize how many things can potentially go wrong, and how regularly they can easily, you know, reach out to you if you're a DIY landlord or the agent, if you're working with an agent. So it really is one of those things when it comes to maintenance, you could be spending a lot, or you can be, you know, spending a good amount of money, depending, as we're saying, on how you're also doing your maintenance. Whether you're going to be a cheapskate throughout and, you know, keep putting, you know, cheap doors, cheap hinges, maybe not even put, you know, now we're putting LED lights. They're slightly more pricier, but they last longer. With students, they'll keep lights on all the time. They won't be mindful of, you know, switching them off. So are you going to rather pay a little extra in order to make sure that you get better quality, you know, appliances, as you're even saying? Because I think it's also one of those things, I've seen it with a lot of new landlords who are in student accommodation. When you start furnishing the place, you go for the cheapest kind of furniture, so you're able to get those students in, whether it's, you know, the cheapest second or third hand fridge, microwave, the beds, and whatever the case is. And it's the stuff that just breaks. You know, 2 months into a student being in, the bed is broken, and you essentially as a landlord are going to need to deal with that because you didn't put in the right amount of money to buy durable furniture or appliances. So it's definitely one of those things you need to be very aware of, because it can creep into your bottom line quite heavily. Because if you're able to then track it, you know, let's say the first year and then the second year, and you realize how many of these small things you keep just, you know, buying one by one, you end up spending such a huge amount of money. So it definitely is one of those things that you want to be aware of. Now, Zach, I think before we start wrapping up, one of the things that I'd want us to also explore is for landlords who have been in student accommodation, perhaps they haven't been running it as well as you've outlined this evening, because you've given us great tips for almost from the top to going down, and how you also operationalize essentially your student accommodation business. How do they get back on track? Because I'm sure some of them, last year we can say so many things happened, but now it's a new year. There are students who are going to look for a place, and let's make the assumption that they will get the students, but what can they do between now and when the academic calendar almost officially opens? I know it's opening slightly later than normal this year, to almost get back online so that their student accommodation investment still gives them good yield, and they don't find themselves losing money in the months to come.
Right, so that's perfect. That brings me down to the third sort of point, which is the systematic level. Now, you're looking at people who've had student accommodations, and even those that are just starting out. You've got to look at your student accommodation as a system. So the systematic level is going to enable you to have time. Why I say it enables you to have time, systems will help you reduce your admin, and it will help you standardize. It will help you do things repeatedly without your presence or intervention being required. So a landlord would want to look at what sort of systems are out there that can assist me in my student accommodation. And systems can go from I need to acquire new quality students. How do I find new quality students? Do I need to go physically and put up adverts at the university? Do I need to go put my adverts on private property? How do I get students? So if you've systemized the way that you're pulling in your students and how you're attracting your students, they come to you. You don't do the work, they will come to you. You need to also systemize for negligence. And when I say systemize for negligence, again, students will do things like leaving lights on, leaving water running, taps keep breaking. They don't report breakages. Now, if you haven't systemized for negligence, a system that will enable you to know when there's leaks, to know when there's an overusage of energy, it's going to be very difficult to save money. So if you do the investment to systemize and have systems that can monitor your water usage, monitor how much how the light usage, and those sort of things, that will help you save money and be ready when the students come back. You also then systemize from the operational level of once your students have come in and they're living there. How do they interact with you as landlord? Because you could have a case whereby students are forever contacting the landlord and you don't see that time where you're always dealing with issues. Now, how do you resolve issues that are happening on campus systematically? That's where having and investing in the right system between you and your management company, or if you are self-managed, how you react to a student's call. So systemizing your current student accommodation would be your best move now as a current landlord in order to understand where to make money. Because if you don't know, you don't know. So if you don't record it, you don't know. So you've got to systemize your place to maximize its return.
And we often don't do that, right, Zach? We don't usually put in the right systems, especially when it comes to a lot of our property investments. I think a lot of landlords who do it themselves don't get into the habit of getting a system early on and tweaking it along the way until you find that sweet spot where everything really does almost run like clockwork, whether it is, whether let's say you use tools like the TPN rent book or other tools that you're going to be using if you're doing everything yourself. And you know that on this day of the month, this is when you're recording X things, and you know the emails get sent out automatically. So you're also not having to manually do certain things. So I think it is one of those things you want to get into the habit of as somebody who is in property, regardless of whether it's student accommodation or any other kind of property, that put in the right systems early on. I know I'm guilty of this. That's why I'm talking about it. I'm very guilty of it. And so I know I need to change my ways because the way I sometimes do it is not particularly sustainable. And I think the busier you get, the easier it is for certain things to then slip through the cracks, which is the last thing you want, right? So when you put in those systems, yes, like you're going to say, I know things are slipping through the cracks. What did you want to add there?
Yes, I was going to say that with systemizing, it doesn't have to be electronic. You can start off a system being very, very manual. You can't, I'm just going to move my camera here. If you can see, sorry, this is just on all light fixtures in your house. It's just a little note that you have to inform students and users on switching off the lights. I have similar sort of notices around all water points, around any energy using points. I have something to make people aware of energy usages and savings. So you can start off very simply by making it manual and then gradually build up. When your students are used to seeing the fact that they need to switch lights off, it'll be easy for them to get a pop-up message on their phone that reminds them of things like you left the lights on in your room, make sure you switch it off next time.
And I guess this is one of those things where you also don't want to overwhelm yourself as a landlord, especially when you're starting off. So you can do the things manually so that you also get used to them. And I know that there are all kinds of cool apps and tools that are now on the market that are definitely able to use those at some point. And that doesn't need to be the starting point. right? Because with some of them, there's probably going to be a monthly or an annual cost involved. So you also don't want to start off your journey with incurring all kinds of costs without actually having a fundamental understanding of all the things behind running your student accommodation. So it is sometimes probably better to start, we'll say, in grade 1 and move yourself up to finally being in matric, where, I mean, I know, for example, Zach, and I know you're also aware of it, once you've been able to make sure that even your whole house is as smart as possible, and this is a student accommodation place, you're able to see the water usage at any given point on the app. You're able to monitor the electricity usage, even when it's prepaid, because you still want to, tell your students that, hey, you're actually consuming a lot of, electricity. So as much as I know you're buying it, you don't want them to have to spend, let's say, 1,200 on electricity. So all these little things, you're able as a landlord to monitor them online. You get messages if, for example, somebody tries to bridge electricity, because you sometimes do get those instances. So all those little, we'll say, nice to have tools that as you gradually move up, you're definitely going to want to invest in. You don't need to start there. So I think as a landlord, also don't feel as though that needs to be the starting point. It doesn't. You still have time to get yourself there and to also budget your way there, right? Because I think that, and this is something that we didn't touch on as much this evening, is around the budgeting when it comes to student accommodation. Because I think oftentimes people, a lot of landlords, you're counting on that X amount of money coming in. You know the bond is this amount, your rates and taxes is this amount. And they typically will then, use all of the money and, almost transfer it into their personal account. Some of the landlords, I know the rent is going straight into their personal account. So you're not even, as you're advising us earlier, you're not even running it like a business where you say, this is how much money. I mean, if you want to get a certain portion, it must be a standardized amount every month. Do you have an emergency fund? Because if there's a maintenance issue that comes up, you need to have the funds for it. So Zach, I think that's definitely one of the things that we tend to struggle with. I can already foresee we're going to bring you back for student accommodation, because it is one of those topics that a lot of people want to explore. And even though we're in the middle of, COVID, and there are many reservations around going into student accommodation, people still want to go into it because they see the potential that it has. And yet they just don't quite know how to go about, going in, and whether even things like pricing, and should you be running it yourself? Should you rather get somebody else to run it? But before I let you go, Zach, any final tip for viewers at home when it comes to, their student accommodation investment?
100%. I would say that they must remember that it's an investment. And an investment, it takes time to mature. It needs to be nurtured, and also it needs to be understood. So if they're going into the student accommodation class of investment, they must understand that there is a lot to be made, there is a lot to be learned, but money can be lost. It still is a risky class, but a very profitable class when done correctly.
We've got a question here from Facebook. It's coming from Alan Mayer, who asks, what's the average cost for student rental?
Rentals vary based on your areas. Like Cape Town is slightly more expensive than Joburg, Durban. So you can go anywhere, if it's on Nefsus, 3.5, 3.2, depending on where you are, up to, in Cape Town, I think it goes up to about 4K per bed.
Yeah, it is on
private accommodations, I mean, if you look at places like in Pretoria, you can find accommodations for 5,000-6,000 Rand because of the demand and the quality of the accommodation. So it really is depending on geographically where you are and what the demand is.
And Zach, that's a great place to leave it in. And I think one of the things from that question is also, in the event where you want to go into student accommodation, track the area that you're going into, because there isn't, you're not going to try and use let's say, average out all the different provinces, because the markets are very different across the various provinces and across the various cities. So even a price point, for example, in Joburg versus in Pretoria is still very different. And so you really want to understand the specific sort of city where you want to do student accommodation, and also which students you're catering for. So if you're looking at a Pretoria, you've got your UP, you've got your TUT, you've got your UNISA. Which student demographic is it? Because you also tend to find that depending on which university you want to primarily get students from, the price point will also slightly change. So really do make sure that you do your research. It's very easy to get the rental data for student accommodation. A lot of the guys put the price up. So you also want to make sure that you're pegging yours at the right level, because there is quite a lot of private accommodation that's typically available. Obviously, the ones that are very close to campus tend to be filled quicker than the ones that are slightly away from campus. So you really want to make sure that you get the right price point. That's not just going to cover your costs. You obviously want to make your margins and be able to budget efficiently as much as possible. But Zach, we are going to leave it there this evening. You want to add one last thing?
Oh, yes, I was going to say, when you were talking about your price point, I think it's also important for people to remember to actually pay themselves, because it is an investment that will mature. So if you pay yourself, you will skip the mistake of taking all of your money and putting it into your personal account.
Yeah.
So people just need to remember that. Pay yourself a salary. No one runs a business by taking all of the income and spending it.
Yeah. Look, I actually nearly said it depends which business you're running, because I know we've seen those kinds of horror stories in South Africa. But Zach, we're going to leave it there this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Zama. It was great being on.
And that is Zhakele Myeza, who's the founder of Bus Stop Properties. We're exploring student accommodation as an investment. And we're certainly quite excited. We're going to keep the conversation going on social media. I'm looking forward to seeing the comments and some of the questions that you have down here below. Of course, you can catch me on my own social media at @zamantungwa_K. And that's going to be a wrap from myself and the rest of the team this evening. We're back on your screens tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Until then, hoping you're staying home and staying safe.
Hi, I'm Blanche, and I'm part of the SA Women's Hockey team, and I'm the technical director of Tax Hockey, and I'm also the assistant coach for the first team ladies. I moved to Ferry Glen about 5 years ago. Ferry Glen is a really safe place and the people are really kind. Some of my friends live really close by in suburbs like Equestria and Olympus. In the morning I will wake up, make myself a cup of coffee, go for a jog in the Ferry Glen Nature Reserve, or even just in the neighborhood. It's safe, quiet, and the environment is really nice. I love Ferry Glen because I'm near the city, but I'm not in the city. I like to go to Pretoria Country Club to clear my mind, on my own, to relax and just to enjoy a round of golf. In Pretoria East we really have nice places to visit, like Menlyn Mall and Brooklyn Mall that is really close by. There are also a lot of top schools in the area, like Pretoria Boys and Hoërskool Menlo Park. One of the most beautiful places to see the whole of Pretoria is the Fort Kapperkop viewpoint. And that's my neighborhood.